Most Australian voters, when faced with a Senate ballot paper, will follow the instructions to the minimum and write 6 preferences above the line. Now, to count those votes, workers for the Australian Electoral Commission will data enter them, so all the preferences go into a computer for the electronic distribution of preferences, and at the end of that, they announce which senators got elected. And then the AEC publishes 2 documents to the website. One is the distribution of preferences itself, saying which senator was elected at which count and how many votes were transferred from one candidate to the next. And along with that, there is a CSV file of the preferences written onto each of the formal votes in the state or territory. And those votes are tagged to the House of Representatives division in which the voter was enrolled and the polling place. And that gives an incredibly rich data set. Unlike in the House of Reps, where you go a couple of suburbs over and it's a different set of candidates, for the Senate, everyone in the state is facing the same set of choices, and they're giving quite detailed opinions in the form of usually 6 ranked parties. So it's a wonderful data set to play with. But it is a little bit unwieldy. You're looking at hundreds of megabytes for the CSV file for New South Wales with about 5 million voters, lots of candidates below the line. So it can be a little bit difficult to get analysis done quickly with it. If you're sort of used to making graphs in Excel, for example, you really want to be able to write a script to analyze the data. So a couple of elections ago, I wrote a program, the Senate Preference Explorer, that helps doing some sorts of analyses on the Senate preference data that I thought would be of interest to people. These table types here, step forward, in, first, end, preferences, and so on. I've just released version 2 of this software, which contains these custom queries. Now, this one involves a sort of mini language that I have developed over the past couple of months, and I feel like that deserves a tutorial. I think if you're the sort of person who likes playing with Senate ballot paper data, you can probably work out how the other ones work. The custom queries would be a little bit more difficult. So the purpose of this video is to show off some examples of what you can do with it. It drastically expands the sorts of tables that you can generate from this data source. But some of you might not have seen this before, so I will go through the earlier table types as well. A couple of preliminaries. There's nothing about the distribution of preferences in this software. It does not tell you which senators got elected. There's nothing about quotas or surpluses or transfers. It's just what numbers were written on the ballot papers, and specifically what formal preferences were written on the ballot papers. Some people, for example, vote both above the line and below the line. In those cases, if the below the line vote is formal, then that's what counts. But if the below the line vote is informal, like say they go 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5, 6, etc., 2 4s, that's not allowed, then it will fall back to the above the line vote. And so this software only considers the formal preferences, which means I'm throwing away a little bit of information about the preferences that got written in, and there was maybe an accidental slip up in the numbering. But it's just a little bit cleaner to only consider the formal preferences. It means that my tallies of the primary votes agree exactly with the AEC's results page. On a similar note, this software you'll often see EXH for exhaust. That doesn't mean that the vote actually exhausted in the distribution of preferences. It just means that in whatever calculation I was looking at, those votes stopped marking any more preferences by that point. And so since most voters will give 6 preferences above the line, this program will show most votes exhausting at preference 7. Now, if you want to try this yourself, I'll put links to download it in the description. And when you run it, you'll get a window that looks similar to this, but the map will probably have API key required watermarks, at least if you're doing this in 2025. The third-party library that I'm using for the map, Qt, is currently defaulting to Thunder Forest for its OpenStreetMap tiles. And I'm not going to give you my API key, but if you want to sign up and get rid of the watermark, There are instructions here of a file you can modify to get rid of it, or you can choose to load a different OpenStreetMap tile server. Now, the AEC publishes CSV files of the preferences, but to use this software, you'll need to download SQLite databases. These sort of take these CSV data and get rid of the preferences that don't count because they're informal for one reason or another. And there's also some auxiliary information, such as the latitude and longitude of the polling places to plot them on the map. And actually, these files are somewhat larger than the AEC's files because I store every preference in duplicate. I have both what preference was given to Group A, what preference was given to Group B, to Group C, and so on, but also who got preference 1, who got preference 2, who got preference 3. And that means that depending on the type of calculation we're doing, I can make it more efficient by reading the preference in the appropriate way. So if I want to see just a distribution of the first preference votes, like how many people voted Labour, how many people voted Liberal, and so on, then the software would be grabbing the part of the database that has the who got preference 1 field. But if I'm doing a two-party preferred calculation, and it's just, okay, for each vote, did they preference Labour first or Coalition first, then it would be going to the parts of the fields in which there's the what preference number was given to Labour, what preference number was given to the Coalition. So let's load 2025 WA, get an empty map to start with. As I mouse over it, it sort of shows me the division name, but at the moment I haven't loaded any numbers into it. The table on the left, we're starting above the line. Table type step forward means that we're starting at preference 1, and then we'll choose one of these groups, and then we'll look at their second preferences. Showing percentages, the other options here are votes and total percentages. At the moment, there's no difference between these two, but there will be very shortly. And in Western Australia, so this is the statewide totals, you can choose to restrict it to just one House of Representatives division. So 35.27% of formal votes in WA were above the line, 1 for Labor, 26% to the Liberal Party, 12% to the Greens, 5.6% One Nation, and so on. If I click on ALP, a few things happen. The second column of the table shows me the second preferences of the voters who gave their first preference to Labor. 49.22% of them went to the Greens. Now, if you haven't looked at Senate ballot paper data before, this is already a little bit interesting because the ALP How to Vote card recommended the Greens at 2, and this tells us that more than half of the above-the-line Labor voters do not follow the How to Vote card even to preference 2. The second most common second preference choice, actually the Liberal Party. Legalised cannabis gets 8% of the Labor voters' second preference. Also, when I clicked on the Labor table cell here, I had the middle table filled out here with the Labor vote by division across WA. You can sort it alphabetically or by the vote percentage. And the map filled up with colours. I can zoom in to Perth and we can see Labor's vote percentage highest in the sort of outer suburb areas. You can also switch to election day booths. Plenty of people are voting early these days, but there are enough people voting on the day that this is the most fun, detailed map to look at. And you can mouse over a booth to it'll say the name of the seat and the name of the House of Rep seat and the name of the booth and the percentage of the cell that we've clicked on restricted to just that booth. There's also pre-poll booths. This one's less interesting because there aren't as many pre-poll booths. They're a lot more centralised, and so there's a lot of numbers drawn right over the top of each other because the pre-poll voting centres you can often vote for several different, if you're enrolled in several different House of Reps divisions as a sort of ordinary pre-poll voter. Let's go back to the divisions. If I click on, if I'm sort of working my way left now, cross tables by division and booth. So if I click on division, this shows me the basically this column here of the Labor vote by division now just becomes one column in this big table. It's this one over here. If I sort by Labor, Cowan 43.22, that's that one. But I also get all of the other parties that I could have clicked on in the first column of the main table. The base here is the sum, like the percentage base on which all of these are calculated. And since we're covering all of the possibilities here, these are 100%. If I were to click on 1 Labor 2 Green, now we're seeing percentages relative to only the Labor votes, varying between 40% or 39.4% out in Durack, which is, zoom out, this enormous division out here, rural areas, up to 60% in inner city Perth. If I click the cross table now, the base is giving me the percentage on which these percentages are defined. So 46.78% of the Labor voters in Brand gave their second preference to the Greens, and 41.84% of the voters in Brand gave their first preference to Labor. So that's how those percentages work. And you can sort the columns by clicking on one of these. Reverse sort. Obviously, no second preferences can go to Labor, given that the first preference went to Labor. And so you can sort as you like. You can revert back to where it started. There's copy and export CSV. If you copy, let me go bring up a spreadsheet, Control V to paste, and you can then do whatever you want to do with that data in a spreadsheet. Export CSV just takes this data and exports to a CSV file. There's also a cross table button in the first column, and this is going to be every possible choice of the first cell that we click and then the second, although I've already clicked on 2, so this will be every choice of the second and every choice of the third. So it's the third preference going to the column, given that the first preference went to Labor and the second preference went to the row party. So it's sorting automatically by the second preferences here. So of the voters who went 1 ALP 2 Green, which is 49% of 35%, which is about 17.36%, 50.65% gave a third preference to legalize cannabis. The abbreviations here are for the most part just taken from the AEC, and they often use old party abbreviations, even as the names change. CYA is the Trumpet of Patriots, because as a legal matter, that organisation descends from the Country Alliance, and they just haven't updated the AEC hasn't updated their abbreviation for them. And once again, you can sort by row or column. Cross table by booth is the same as for division, except it's a CSV file and you get the latitude, longitude coordinates for each of the polling places. And it says booth, but it also includes, for example, postal votes as a separate line item for each division. So what can we say about these preferences? As I said, the Labor Party had a vote card, recommended Greens at 2, and roughly half of the voters followed them. Roughly half of the voters followed them to preference 3 of those half who followed to preference 2. So only a quarter of the Labor above the line voters are following them to preference 3. But of those who did go 1 Labor, 2 Greens, 3 legalised cannabis, that's a pretty specific set of 3 parties. Labor and Greens are sort of well-known parties, but legalised cannabis is a fairly specific one. So if you followed that particular order, then you're probably following the Labor how to vote card deliberately. And now we can see the percentage for the 4th preference here rising substantially. So 83% of the voters who went Labor, Greens, legalised cannabis then gave their 4th preference to the Animal Justice Party. 89% of those went to the Democrats. And then if you follow the Labor how to vote card to preference 5, you're probably going to preference 6 as well. I assume this is the Socialist Alliance, abbreviations, SAL, Socialist Alliance, yep, 96.7%. And then 99% of those votes will stop their preferencing and not mark preference 7. If I click on one of these other parties here, like let's look at the 1 Labor, 2 Liberal voters, sort of most common here in Curtin. That's a very strong, traditionally strong, let's say, Liberal area. These days a seat has gone to a Teal Independent. 34% of the next preferences go to the Greens from this group of people, then to the Nationals, then to the Democrats, then to Great Australian Party, and then exhausting. But we're not seeing the percentages rise substantially, because these people, these are voters for the most part who are just sort of making up their own minds. There's no particular reason to rank why a large group of voters would all rank parties in the same order. And so there's just a big pile of parties available to receive these preferences, and we don't get those numbers like 95% of people in this path picking one particular party on preference 5 or preference 6. If we look at the Liberal Party voters, most popular in Curtin, second preference going to the Nationals, so 58% of Liberal above the line voters gave their second preference to the Nationals, and then of those 68.8% going to One Nation at preference 3. These numbers on the whole a little bit higher than we saw for the Labor voters, so the how to vote card following somewhat more faithful on the Liberal side. I'm not sure if that's a general trend across the country or across all elections. But on this particular case, how to vote following a little bit higher, and again exhausting at preference 7. And again, we can look at people who deviate, so 1 Liberal, 2 One Nation, Nationals, Trumpet of Patriots, Australian Christians, Great Australian Party. Again, there's just a lot of possibilities for where these preferences would go, and so they deviate in lots of different ways. If we look at a minor party, so we go to the Greens, most popular second preference for Greens voters is Labor, but then we're seeing the percentage decrease here. This is not something we particularly saw, at least not this drastically, when looking at the major party preferencing. Most popular third preference is legalised cannabis, but only 31.6%. Animal Justice Party about 18%, Liberals 13.8%. If we follow this, we're not seeing really high percentages, maybe by the time we get to preference 6, but it's not really following the same pattern. And that's because this is not the Greens how to vote card. This is the Greens how to vote card. So Greens voters, very sort of independent-minded. I think it's probably true for most minor party voters for 2 reasons. One is that if you are following politics enough to know that you want to vote for a particular minor party, you are less likely to want to follow a prescribed recommendation for the preferences. And also the minor parties probably don't have as many volunteers on the booths to hand out how to vote cards to people. Right, that's not very dramatic, but that's a sort of phenomena that we see in the preferencing of the voters and how it relates to their how to vote cards. Something that is a little bit more dramatic is if we go back one election staying in WA. Let's look at the Labor votes. 55% going Green, 46% Animal Justice, and if you go through those three, you're probably following the How to Vote card. Okay, if we look at the Liberal Party, much greater split here, 33.8% going to Australian Christians, 16.6% going to the Western Australia Party. They don't have much of a profile. If I click on the Australian Christians, reasonably high numbers, except in the seat of Curtin. And so this is telling us that there's something different about the Liberal voters in Curtin compared to the rest of WA. And what I assume it was a different How to Vote card issued only within the electorate of Curtin. Now, I don't have any insight as to why that is. I can speculate that since there was a Teal independent challenger, maybe the local branch didn't want to make it look like the Liberal Party were all sort of conservative Christians, and instead they recommended a preference to the Western Australia Party, more centrist, I think, in outlook, at least sort of more inoffensive in the naming anyway. And like, that's an extremely stark difference. Do be aware that the bounds of the colour scale do update automatically based on what I'm clicking on, so it's not necessarily exactly a like-for-like comparison. But the general picture of the colours is correct here. There's a very systematically different voting pattern for Liberal voters at the second preference, either in Curtin or outside of it. If I switch to the election day booths, you can see it's very stark. It's right up to the boundary. And then if you're a booth just inside Curtin, only 2, 6, 3% of voters are giving their second preference to the Christians. And just on the other side of the boundary, it's 53, 34, 35, 48 over here, 49, 50 down there. So if you just sort of eyeball that regression, you'd say something like a Liberal Party How to Vote card is worth, let's say, somewhere between 35 and 50 percentage points in terms of the preference flow to preference 2. If we look at it in the reverse direction, WA Party getting about 11% of the second preferences outside the boundary for Curtin, and somewhere around 43, 48, 59, 60. So again, about between sort of 35, 50 percentage points difference there. Plausibly, this understates a little bit the influence of the How to Vote card, because I imagine that if you're the sort of person who wants to follow a How to Vote card, maybe you look it up online beforehand, and so a lot of people could be sharing How to Vote cards, and you might not be getting the one that the Liberal Party intended for your particular electorate. So maybe the actual influence of the How to Vote cards is a little bit higher than what these say, although that's sort of speculation on my part. What I would take away is that this sort of order of magnitude of these sort of ballpark figures for how much the How to Vote card does actually influence the second preference. We've seen that most voters don't actually follow them all the way through, but at least for the second preference, it is worth something, and even for the later preferences, it's worth something, albeit less. Let's go back to the divisions. We follow this through. Now, a lot of parties on the ballot paper here. Those who went 1 Liberal, 2 Australian Christians, that's a very specific choice for preference 2. The Australian Christians don't have a huge profile, less than 2%. Maybe they got some below the line, so let's call it 2% of the primary vote. So if you're giving them a second preference, quite likely that you're following a How to Vote card. 89% follow the How to Vote to preference 3, and then 96 of those going to preference 4. Whatever CYA was called 3 years ago, Australian Federation Party. And then look at this, it splits on preference 6 between One Nation, the sort of some of the outer suburbs and the rural areas, and Democrats in inner city Perth. And again, no particular insight from me as to what led to this decision. I don't know if it was a strategic one that the Liberal Party said they'd agreed to a preference deal with these parties, sort of splitting electorate by electorate, or if they're trying to signal to inner city voters who generally don't like One Nation that Liberal Party also isn't recommending a preference to One Nation, but in the rural areas they do put One Nation on their how to vote card. These are possibilities. I'm just trying to infer them from this ballot paper data without really knowing what went on behind the scenes. This kind of splitting of the how to vote cards isn't unique to the Liberal Party. If I go back another election, 2019 Victoria, let's zoom in on Melbourne, Labor, and we've got quite a split on preference too between G. Vic for the Greens and Darren Hinch's Justice Party. And Greens getting a lot of preferences in these Melbourne electorates. This is, you can see in the table here, 62% down to 55%. McNamara, Melbourne, Cooper and Wills, either sort of the Greens target seats in Melbourne. And Darren Hinch's Justice Party getting, more of the preferences outside of those 4 Greens target seats. And again, I'm only speculating that this is a strategic choice to sort of signal to voters either in the inner city that you're sort of friendly with the Greens, or in the outside the inner city that you're sort of friendly with the Darren Hinch's brand of justice. Those following it. It looks like we've got some more splitting going on there. Some of these people might have, a lot of the people who give Green second preference, given that outside of inner Melbourne it was Darren Hinch on the how to vote card, a lot of these 1 Labor, 2 Greens voters are not following the how to vote. Although it looks like they are sort of coming back, they're following some sort of recommendation, whether it's exactly on the card or whether they've swapped around the order themselves. We do end up getting these really high percentages. Let's zoom into the booths, have a look at this discontinuity. So this is 1 Labor, 2 Darren Hinch. And at the discontinuity, we're looking sort of 5% on the sort of the inner city Green side, 27, 20, 34, 38, somewhere around, there's some 40s here. So yeah, let's call it 30%, 30 percentage point difference. If I click on the Greens, this is actually quite a nice gradient. Very popular to preference the Greens second in inner Melbourne, and it's quite smoothly decreasing as you go towards the north. So at this discontinuity is sort of 46, 42, 49 on one side, 24, 17, 18 on the other side. Maybe worth about 25 percentage points there, or maybe it's a little bit 30 odd over here. I haven't run the numbers exactly. I'm sure if you put this into a very complicated statistical model, you could get a more precise estimate out of it. But as a sort of a rough ballpark, 30 percentage point change in the preferencing, and again that might understate it because some people might be reading how to vote cards from the other side of the electorate that they're enrolled in. We zoom out, staying in Victoria, maybe we skip forward to this year. Another way we can see different preferencing patterns that are systematic according to a how to vote card. In Victoria and New South Wales, the coalition runs a joint ticket, but the Liberal and National parties are still separate organisations. And so the most common second preference for coalition voters in Victoria this year was Family First, 36.6%. But you can see there are these much darker colours out here. If we, there's 4.76% Gippsland, Nichols, Mallee, Bendigo, Corwell. Not sure exactly where the line should be drawn here. Bendigo is sort of in between. the rest of the numbers, like there's much more continuous distribution here, 22, 23, 25. So the break is somewhere between Mallee and Corwell. Maybe it includes Bendigo. If I switch to the second preference for One Nation, now it looks like Bendigo is definitely in the grouping with Gippsland, Mallee and Nichols. And these are the seats that are held by the Nationals. So they're handing out their own how to vote cards, which give a recommendation to One Nation at preference 2, whereas the Liberal Party how to vote cards had Family First at 2. Now the gap, there's sort of 18 versus 44 or 50 or 60. There's sort of a ballpark kind of estimate of the impact of the how to vote, but it's not really as clean a figure as we saw in the inner city, where you have the booths varying on one side of the electorate boundary to the other, because we're in rural areas here, so much larger gap between polling places. It is probably, like, it's meaningful, but there's also the fact that the rural voters are going to be more likely to preference One Nation anyway. So that would be a reason to, if we're just looking at the raw totals by division, that would this might be a slight overestimate of the impact of the how to vote card, because even if the Nationals recommended a second preference to Family First, more of the Nationals voters would be more likely to preference One Nation anyway. So in some sense, the how to vote card might reflect the electorate rather than only driving it. Okay, so that's the step forward mode of the Senate Preference Explorer. There are several others. I think the most popular, apart from the step forwards, would be End Party Preferred. Now, a classic two-party preferred would be Labor versus Coalition. So click on Labor, click on Coalition, press Calculate. And in Victoria this year, Labor won the Senate two-party preferred 52.7 to 40. This is of the above-the-line votes only, with 7.26 in exhaust, meaning that those Senate votes did not preference either Labor or the Coalition. And you can see the preference flow breakdown, Greens going very, very heavily to Labor, 85 to 6. One Nation polarised not as heavily in the other direction, 59 to 16 to the Coalition, and sought to see who's going most heavily to Labor. It's Greens, Victorian Socialists, Australian Voice, and most heavily to the Coalition, One Nation, Libertarians, Family First. We don't have to do Labor versus Coalition. In fact, we don't even have to do two parties here. We can just do like a one-party preferred. So we can pick, because it's basically, did the voter give a preference at all to, here I've chosen legalized cannabis, or did they not? And the total here down the bottom, let's sort this, sort of one party preferred, exhaust defeats the legalized cannabis party 56 to 44 above the line, and maybe below the line it's a little bit different. I'd have to check. But usually you'd be putting more than one party into a end party preferred, and you can do, for example, a four-party preferred. Let's turn off legalized cannabis. So Labor, Coalition, Greens, One Nation, 38.5, 34.7, 16.6, 8.5, and only a very small minority of votes do not preference any of these four. And we can have a look at the individual ones, like who preferences One Nation most heavily. It's the Jared Rennick Party, followed by the Libertarians and Trumpet of Patriots. Most likely to go to the Greens is the Victorian Socialists and Australia's Voice. This is the Fatma Payman's party. Very, very strong preference flow to the Greens. She was a Labor senator before. Not sure if she quit or was pushed out over Gaza. And her voters very, very friendly to the Greens rather than her old party. Let's go to New South Wales, do the same calculation. Interestingly here, the Australia's Voice, not so strong to the Greens, 34% rather than over 50%. Still, like, reasonably strong, but there is a bit of a systematic difference. Pretty small sample sizes here. The Australia's Voice is not getting a large fraction of the primary vote, so we're looking at pretty small numbers here, especially when we divide them up by division. Wouldn't necessarily want to read too much into it, but it is sort of higher in the Sydney area than in the rural areas. So there's a lot of fun with this. You can do sort of, what about Labor versus Greens? Labor wins easily, but Coalition versus Greens, it's closer. Coalition beats the minor party, but not by a huge amount. Again, Greens most popular in the sort of inner city area. So people definitely use this one, especially to sort of forecast ongoing Senate counts when we don't have the preferences yet. We just have progressive tallies of the primary votes. And so you can try to work out, okay, where will the preferences go from the micro and minor parties left in the count? And you can sort of guess who will be the last two parties in contention and see how they've split between those two. So I think this N party preferred tool is, along with the Step Forward, one of the two most popular modes of the Senate Preference Explorer. But there are a few others. In first N preferences, later preferences, and preference sources. And for these, I won't make any original observations. This has been written about before. I'll go to Queensland and I'll compare the One Nation preferences 2016 versus 2025. Okay, so I've loaded in first N preferences by 6, which is, I guess, the most natural thing to look at. Most voters are writing 6 preferences on the ballot paper, and if you're writing a preference for someone, that's a positive preference. Those who marked One Nation in their first 6 preferences, which in 2016 Queensland was 29.4% of above the line voters, 47.6% also preferenced the LNP in their first 6, 40.7% going to the Katter Party, 40.2% to Labor. So yes, very slightly more associated with the Conservative side when just looking at the association with the major parties, but it's not a huge polarization here. There are a lot of people preferencing the Labor Party and also preferencing One Nation back in 2016. And if I sort of, those who preferenced LNP, about 28% also preferenced One Nation. Those who preferenced Labor, about 26% or 25% preferencing One Nation. So again, slightly more associated with the Conservative side, but not by a huge margin. And these other two are going to tell a similar story. So later preferences, I'll fix just the primary votes and then consider which parties do they preference somewhere between 2 and 6. So not necessarily on preference 2 like in the Step Forward, but anywhere later on up to preference 6. LNP, most common preference recipients, Family First, Katter Australian Party, Shooters, CDP. One Nation was not on LNP how to votes back then. 23% of their above-the-line voters gave One Nation a preference. Labor, 23%. Again, it's pretty similar. Preference sources, so now we're sort of looking at it in the reverse direction. So of those who gave a preference somewhere between 2 and 6 to One Nation, 37% gave their first preference to the LNP, 28% to Labor. This is a bit of a gap, but a lot of it is just because there were more LNP votes than Labor votes. If I just go back to the Step Forward, there's 33.9% versus 25%. This is more LNP votes than Labor votes across Queensland. in 2016, and therefore more total going to One Nation than Labor votes. If we instead now look at 2025 Queensland, go through the same, let's see, One Nation in the first six, 76% also have LNP in their first six, and only 35% have Labor in their first six. So this is a much larger gap. Those who preference Labor in the first six, 29% also preference One Nation. LNP, One Nation's on the LNP how to vote card now, and as we've seen, not everyone follows a how to vote card, but it does have some impact. This is a much higher figure than it was in 2016. Later preferences, so looking specifically at One LNP, 76% giving a preference to One Nation. Labor, only 21%. And so the preference sources will tell the same story by this point. Of those who preference One Nation, 57% were LNP voters and only 16% were ALP voters. So, yeah, One Nation has basically polarized very much to the conservative side of politics, as opposed to 9 years ago when if you only judged it by the preference data, they would have seemed like they were some kind of centrist in some sense party, because they were picking up preferences and giving preferences to both the major parties almost equally. Now it's very much polarized. And party preferred, probably a cleaner comparison. One Nation this year in Queensland, 56.6 to 15.8% in favour of the LNP. If I go back to 2016, (26.7 to 22.8). So One Nation voters, again, very slightly, according to the preference data, were slightly right of centre in 2016, but very firmly on the right in 2025. That concludes the built-in table types. So next up will be the custom tables. It's going to be new. Okay, back from a quick cut. Custom queries. Actually, let's go Queensland 2025. Go to this year. A custom query consists of 4 components. All of them are optional. The filter defines a subset of the votes, either above the line or below the line. That will be included potentially in the table that we calculate. If you leave it blank, it lets in all of the votes, whether that's above the line, or if you went to below the line, it'd be all the below the line votes. Rows defines what we put on the rows. Columns defines what we put on the columns. And then cell is a test that gets applied for every vote on every table cell, whether the vote contributes to that cell. If we leave it blank, it will get accepted. And then there's a calculate button, and then a choice of where we send the output table. There's a pop-up window or main table and map. My suggestion, which you don't have to follow, is that when you have a lot of columns in the table, you'd use the pop-up window, because this area of the main table isn't that wide, but the pop-up window you can sort of maximize and see everything at once. But if you have a small number of columns, then you send it to the main table, and that way you can click on a cell and see the results in the map view. If I run this isn't very interesting because every vote is passing the test. The only non-trivial thing we see here is this filtered base. So this is the percentage of total formal votes that pass the filter. Now the filter is letting in everything above the line, and that's all that there is. So 95.17% of formal votes in Queensland this year were above the line. We just have one table cell. It's not very interesting. 100% everywhere. Okay, what can we do with this? We can add something to the filter. We can go LNP equals 1. Try this again. Now the table cell is still 100% because there's no test in the cell definition here. So every vote that passes the filter is making it into this 100% table cell. The filtered base has changed. Now it's 30.08%. So that's the percentage of all formal votes that were 1 LNP above the line. 30.08. So far, this isn't very interesting map-wise because we haven't sort of defined anything non-trivial in the cell. What can we glean from this so far? The name of the party abbreviation, which has to follow exactly the lettering in this abbreviations pop-up. When you put that into one of these custom queries, it means the preference given to that party. Then we have an equals sign to test for equality. You can, if you want, use a double equals. Like this will also work. Spaces are optional, stylistic. We get the same filtered base. To test if a party was not preferenced, 999. Hopefully we won't ever see a Senate ballot paper with 1,000 candidates because I'm using the 999 code for below the line as well. And here it's telling us that 36.58% of the formal votes were above the line and did not preference the LNP. But it's sort of useless at this stage if we're just making a single table column, a single cell table to put things into the filter and nothing into the cell. So let's just put that in the cell. And now we can see where in Queensland were voters not preferencing the LNP at all. Blair, 45.7%. Rankin, 45.4%. And it's the same link of the clicking on a table cell, seeing the divisions table here that you can export by polling place as well, and the results in the map view election day booths. Put LNP equals 1 in the cell column rather than the filter column, 31.6. When we put it back in the filter, is giving us a filtered base of 30.08 and a total vote of 100% within that filtered base. Now it is 31.6% out of 95.17. And bring up a calculator window and check that those agree. 0.9517 times 31.6, 30.07, so a bit of round off error, but it's the same thing. If you want not equal to, put an exclamation mark before the equal sign. This will just flip it, so instead of 31.6 here, it's now 68.4. If you're used to the Excel or SQL less than, greater than, for not equal to, that also works. And you have comparison operators like greater than 1. So we'll give this the same thing. Because if it's not preferenced, it's treated as 999, which is greater than 1. So greater than 1 and not equal to 1 are effectively the same here. We can also do in 2 to 6. So lower bound of the preferencing that you're interested in, 2 dots, and then the upper bound. These have to be specific integers, like digits that you type, or a keyword nmax, which I'll get to. But you're not allowed to say like LNP in like 2 up to the Labor Party. This won't work. It's a expected integer literal for high bound of in operator. So yeah, you have to actually type a number here. Let's say 2 to 5. You get some numbers. Now, at this stage, there's no reason to do any of these queries with the custom query tool. We could creatively or not creatively use some of the built-in cases to get the same percentages and get them a little bit faster, because the custom queries are a little bit slower than the built-in ones. The built-in tools are sort of handcrafted the calculation algorithm to do exactly that in what I thought was the most efficient way, or at least a decently efficient way. The custom queries, not so carefully crafted. They're very systematic in going through every little case. But as you can see, they're processing the Queensland votes on my computer about 1.5 seconds. I've got an i7 2.7 gigahertz machine with 12 cores, so update your expectations accordingly. Something we could do LNP is not preferenced and Labor is not preferenced. So we're linking two conditions with the AND operator, and the AND operator has to be in lowercase. All of the function names and keywords of this custom query language must be in lowercase. That's to distinguish them from the party abbreviations, which have uppercase letters. You can imagine a party having AND or NPP as an abbreviation. So lowercase letters for the keywords, uppercase letters for the party identifiers, and it is case sensitive. Let's calculate. So this is going to find us a sort of very anti-establishment slice of the electorate, and they're most commonly found in Katter country. 10.78% of the above the line voters not preferencing either major party. There's different ways we could do this, getting the same result. If you're not sure about order of operations, like there's an equal sign here and there's an and like where should the brackets go, you can put parentheses in here to distinguish it. We get the same result. Since the only way the preference numbers for Labor and LNP can be equal is if neither was preferenced. Like if the voter wrote in 8 for the LNP and also 8 for the ALP, that would not be a formal preference and it would not be included in my SQLite databases. So you can also do a search or a filter or whatever on votes that did not preference either major party by doing LNP equals ALP. Same result. I should mention, because the party identifiers have to be exactly what they are in this abbreviations table, the appropriate identifier for the coalition will vary from state to state. Sometimes the Liberal Party runs a separate ticket from the Nationals and they're just LP. In cases in New South Wales and Victoria where they run a joint ticket, then it's LP, NP, and you'll just have to pay attention to that. It'll be fairly obvious when you try to run it. Like if I accidentally put LP here, unrecognized group. Okay. Other functions that we can learn here and doing the same calculation in different ways. We have a min function, and inside parentheses it takes one or more arguments. So ALP, LNP, and if the minimum of these two is 999, then it must be the case that both of them have preference 999, which means they weren't preferenced, and we'll get the same 10.78 once again. If we get max of the two is 999, that means at least one of the two major parties was not preferenced. Not really sure if this means anything. More likely in the regional and rural areas, apparently, because in the inner city, relatively few compared to the regional Queensland failing to preference at least one of the majors. But you do have to pay attention to these updating colour scales. So even though these are dark colours, this is still sort of 58.8%. You can do arithmetic on these, so a little bit of arithmetic. You can add and subtract preference numbers. So if you did ALP plus LNP equals 3, this would collect all votes which went 1 Labor, 2 LNP, or 1 LNP, 2 Labor. That's the only way you can get these things adding up to 3. Don't really know what we'd expect there. They're most common in sort of out towards Ipswich. There's something systematic going on that's very unlikely to get this this particular preferencing pattern, which would definitely not be on a how to vote card, varying from sort of 12, 11% in divisions where it's most likely and down to 5 or less percent in Kennedy. We have a keyword for the number of preferences is n_prefs. So we could say how many voters gave it exactly 6 preferences above the line. 88.34% of above the line voters did that. And there's not a lot of variation across the state here. Most voters above the line are giving exactly 6 preferences. It varies from 85 and a bit percent at its lowest to basically 91% in Capricornia. nprefs equals 1. This will get only, the voters that only gave 1 preference. Some of you, if you're unaware of the Senate voting rules, might be a little bit surprised that this is allowed. The instructions are to number at least 1 to 6 above the line, or at least 1 to 12 below the line. But they do count the vote anyway if you just mark a 1, or you at least 1 above the line will be caught by a savings provision. That's only true in the Senate. If you just vote 1 in the House of Reps, that will be informal. The vote's not counted. For the Senate, you can get away with just a 1. And a small minority of voters just vote 1. There's 1.4% across the state, and there's not much variation. About 1% in sort of inner Brisbane, 2% in Rankin, getting down to southern suburbs, down towards the Gold Coast. This is a little bit more interesting in New South Wales. Let's switch to there, zoom in on Sydney, nprefs equals 1. Here it's 4.85%, and in parts of Western Sydney you're getting well over 10%. This is matching the parts of Sydney where the informal rate of voting in the House of Reps is very high because people are just voting 1 or just a tick or something. And in the House of Reps, it's not counting at all, so it just leads to a very high informal tally. In the Senate, we can see them. These do count, and we can see where they are. We can put election day booths, get some sort of feel for the geography of Sydney. For the most part, we'd expect these people probably from an immigrant background, maybe not so strong at, with their English skills, not understanding the voting system in Australia, but at least the savings provision means that their primary votes are still counted. Let's rows, let's put groups on the rows. So keyword, if we want to have, at the moment I've just been making these 1-cell tables. If I want to define something more interesting, I have to define what I put on the rows, and a keyword if I want the groups, which is parties or unlabeled groups, groups all lowercase. Row equals 1. Let's just get the primary votes. You don't need the custom queries to get the primary votes, but just to show how the syntax works, row equals 1. So lowercase row, as it's working its way through the table, it's taking the value of that row, whatever that happens to be. At the moment, it's a group. So when a vote gets processed and when this table cell gets processed, we'll say, okay, the row is ALP. ALP as an identifier means what preference number was given to the ALP, and if that preference was 1, then it will count. And so if it's not 1, then it doesn't count. It just goes to the total filtered base. And so we can get a map of the distribution of the primary votes across Sydney. We could put a filter, and we could look up what is the distribution of primary votes given that neither major party was preferenced. So ALP equals LPNP. This is New South Wales Liberal Party, National Party running a joint ticket, and so I have to be careful with the identifier. Now it'll be a much smaller filtered base here. Let's run this. 8.6%. And of the people, these sort of anti-establishment voters who are refusing to preference either of the majors, and so you've got One Nation, legalised cannabis. Let's go divisions, zoom out to the state. So about 20% of this group of people are One Nation voters, 17% legalised cannabis, 16% Greens voters. You do have to be careful on the definition of these percentages. It's not that 16% of Greens voters are not preferencing either major party. It's of the voters who don't preference either major party, 16% voted Greens. Let's remove the filter. Another keyword we have is N_max. This is the maximum preference number that can be given on the ballot paper. So it's the number of groups if you're above the line, number of candidates if you're below the line. Let's run this. Now percentages here are very small because most people stop at 6 votes, or 6 preferences, and don't go to however many there are here, 3, 6, somewhere near 20. Interestingly, the most common result for the final preference is actually this exhaust. So what this means in the framework of how this program is treating exhaust, this means that the voters in this cell numbered all except one square above the line, but did not number that final square. Of those who did go on to number all the squares above the line, most common last place was for the Greens. Now we might ask which of these groups was being omitted. So if of the voters who stopped one before the end, who did they not preference? And some of you will already know this, or at least have a very educated guess, because it has been written about elsewhere. Kevin Bonham on his blog has written about this. One of these groups is not like the others. Most of them have all uppercase letters for like an official party abbreviation, except there's Group B, which is an unlabeled box. And a lot of voters are not really sure if they're allowed to put a number in a box that's just completely blank and doesn't have any sort of labeling on it. Maybe they think it's only for below the line voters. And we can test this. We can filter for the voters who gave N_max preferences -1. So all but 1 preferences. Group stays the same. And now we want to look at or count which group was not preferenced. So I'll say row equals 999. And there we go, Group B, 81%. So a fairly large majority of the people who did not mark that final box were omitting Group B. Instead of having groups on the rows, we can have numbers. And one of the common things that I would expect people to put here is N_max, and then possibly a 999 to include exhausting. But if we do here, let's do row equals N_prefs. So now the row value will be taking on these number values and will just be counting a vote to the table cell if the number of preferences was equal to that row's number. So he lots at preference 6. So 85% of above the line voters give exactly 6 preferences. We can see almost 5% giving just the one preference, which is sort of what we saw earlier, Western Sydney. 0.87% giving 18 preferences. It looks like there are 18 groups above the line, and nothing really systematic popping out there of this particularly engaged people with very strong opinions about how they want to rank all 18 parties. The one other little interesting aspect of this is the little bump at 12 preferences, which is presumably people getting confused between the above the line instructions for at least 1 to 6 and the below the line instructions, which are at least 1 to 12. So only 0.15% giving 11 preferences, 0.08% giving 13, but 0.44% giving 12. And this is it's not a big slice of the electorate. It's 0.44% times 96%. But they do have some systematically different preferencing habits, which maybe I'll remember to include later in the tutorial. It doesn't look like it's the same set of people as are only voting one, or at least not coming from the same sort of populations. So just a different set of people, statistically speaking. Let's jump around. South Australia. Make some 2-axis tables. Rows, groups, columns, groups. Row equals 1 and col equals 2. This will be basically like a step forward cross table. And because there'll be a bunch of columns, I'll put it in the pop-up window and we'll sort of lose anything in the map here. Anything interesting anyway. So row equals 1 and col equals 2. The rows and columns are not being treated symmetrically here. So I'm on percentages, and the base column, this is going to be a percentage of the filtered base. So row equals 1. Basically, this means that there's 39.05% of the above the line votes were one Labor, 28% for Liberal. And then in the main body of the table, we have the distribution of the second preferences from the Labor votes on the first row, and then of the Liberal votes on the second row, then on the Greens, etc. So 46% roughly of Labor voters gave their second preference to the Greens, above the line, 13.6% to the Liberal Party, 8.4% to Lambie Network. If I were to swap these around, and these pop-up tables, you can sort of keep them up, which is one advantage of them. They're not linked to the map, but you can keep them hanging around. Now, the base for each row is the number of second preferences that they received. So 21% of the above the line votes gave their second preference to the Greens, and of those, 83.44% were one Labor, 5.2% were one Liberal, and so on. Similarly, the National Party's votes where the votes were 2 for the National Party, I think mostly came from the Liberal Party 1. So rows and columns not treated symmetrically. But if I were to redo this exercise with either votes or total percentages, now with total percentages, all of the percentages are calculated relative to the total number of formal votes, and the main body of this table will become a transpose if I swap the 2 and the 1 in the cell definition. So let's sort by position on the ballot paper so that they're the same, sort columns to row order. So now Libertarian to SOPAR, Fusion, Planet Rescue, Whistleblower Protection, and something else that got truncated. So 1 Libertarian, 2 SOPAR, this is like a donkey vote, 0.19% of the total. And we see that 0.19 at the transpose position in the second table. So with total percentages, these two rows and columns do become symmetric in the main body of the table. So we can do row equals 1 and col in 2 to 6, and this will be similar to a cross table from later preferences. So of the Labor voters, I'm on total percentages here, so maybe let's go back to percentages, which is, I think, what the usual thing that you'd look at is, makes interpretation a lot easier. Of the 39% above the line voters who went for Labor, 78% gave a preference somewhere between 2 and 6 to the Greens, 57% to the Animal Justice Party, and so on. Liberal Party, most common preference targets: Nationals, Family First, One Nation, Lambie. Now, something that I'll do, and it won't give me good results the first time, this is a time when total percentages will actually be useful, is I can do row less than col as my test. And so I did this deliberately once, thinking that this would give me a two-party preferred matrix. I'll just show you what it looks like. And ALP beats Liberal 80.78%, and Liberal beats Labor 64.42%. These are very strange percentages. This particular case is one where total percentages make sense. The counting, or the basic idea of row party is gets a preference number that's less than the column party preference. That logic is sound. It should give us a two-party preferred for each pair of parties. But the problem is, for this application, the percentages here are percentages of the base for each row. And the base for each row consists of the votes that contributed to at least one cell in the row. And so what that means is this calculation here is counting the votes where the Labor preference was a smaller number than the Liberal preference, and then it's dividing by the number of votes that gave a preference to Labor at all. Because if the Labor appears anywhere on the ballot paper in the preferences, it will at least be better than exhaust. So every vote that preferences Labor counts to this base, and that's a very strange ratio, like votes which had Labor before Liberal divided by votes which had Labor somewhere. This is not a meaningful thing to calculate. So if I switch to total percentages, and now this is more meaningful, Labor versus Liberal, 52.66 to 34.68. Let's test this. And party preferred, 52.66 to 34.68. Now, this isn't necessarily an easy table to read. If you want to pick two random parties, you have to be very careful, like Liberal versus legalized cannabis is here, and then so that's 51.44. Your legalized cannabis versus Liberal Party is 29.03. So you have to be a little bit careful locating the correct cells, but nevertheless, I do think it's a nice compact representation of two-party comparisons. Maybe we want direct n-party preferred calculations. The way this works is slightly different from the others, because let's just type in an example. ALP, LP. So NPP for n-party preferred, lowercase, because it's a keyword in the query language. And we don't define a cell definition. So there's no col equals the lesser preference of these two. The definition, putting n-party preferred in the definition of the columns, will mean that the software behind the scenes will be sending votes to the correct one of these two groups, calculate, and we get the same 52.66, 34.68 breakdown as previously. But now we can do more than this. We can do, okay, at this stage we're just doing a 4-party preferred, same as we could do with the n-party preferred. We can get the breakdown of the preference flow by group by putting rows on the groups, and then we do row equals 1 for the cell test, and let's sort this way. Legalized cannabis, I'm on total percentages here, let's put it on percentages. Legalized cannabis, 40% going to the Greens. Trumpet of Patriots, 45.8% to One Nation on the 4-party preferred. So it's sort of behaving as expected. Still, so far, we're not doing anything that we couldn't have done from the n-party preferred. Table type, the built-in one. So let's do something different. We can go 1 to n max and say row equals n prefs. So we'll see the 4-party preferred broken down by the number of preferences written on the ballot paper. And we can see for the small minority of voters who only mark a 1, much lower proportion there of the minor party voters, both Greens and One Nation. 6 is the sort of most common one. This is very similar to the overall 4-party preferred. And then as soon as we go to more than 6 preferences, both the Greens and the One Nation start doing better in this 4-party preferred. And presumably that's because the people who give more than 6 preferences clearly are more disproportionately likely to have opinions about lots of different minor and micro parties, and more likely to prefer at least one of the biggest minor parties. We go to the people who label all 16 boxes, and the Greens are actually beating the Liberal Party in that extremely narrow slice of the electorate. In some states, you sometimes see a bit of a dip for the Greens at 12. It's not so clear in this one. It is like 19% for the 12 preference voters versus 20.6% for the 11 preferences, but it's not rising back up at 13 like it does in some states. Might do this in New South Wales as well. LP, NP for the coalition here. So for 6 preferences, Greens are getting 14%, and then they get 24.5% of the 4-party preferred for 7 preference voters, 26, 22, 25, and then at 12 it drops down to 17.8, and then for 13 it goes back up. And I think this is a real phenomenon. Like, it's a small signal in the results across the different states. But generally speaking, the Greens do slightly worse on 12 preference voters compared to all the others, because as I mentioned earlier, the 12 preference voters are including probably quite a few people who got the ballot paper instructions confused and probably intended to be on the 6 preference line if they'd known if they'd understood the instructions correctly. So slightly different group of people compared to the people who are giving 11 preferences or 13 or 14. There's groups, columns 1 to n max, row equals 1, and n, let's do col equals n prefs. We'll pop this one up to a window. So this will, for each group, the distribution of how many preferences were marked on its primary votes. And 6 is going to be the most for all of these. Even the minor party voters are more likely to give more preferences, but still most people are marking 6 votes, or 6 preferences. See, 5% of Labor's primary votes were just 1s, 5% of the coalition's votes were just 1s. Less for the Greens, only 2% there, and relatively more as we go up to 7+. And we can also flip these around, 1 to n max groups, and now the row will do n prefs and col equals 1. So now we're looking at the primary vote distribution by the number of preferences. Let's sort by number, preference number. So of people who only gave 1 preference, 41% went to Labor, 31% Coalition, 5% legalised cannabis, 5% One Nation, 5% Greens. 6 is pretty similar to the overall state distribution. And if we go down to people who filled in all the boxes above the line, 33.6% Labor, 18% Green, 17% Coalition. So Greens voters disproportionately much more likely to be found in the among the people who number all or almost all the boxes. You can also get, let's go groups on the rows. Columns will be 1 to n max and 999. So we'll have row equals col. So this will give us a distribution of where each group's preference numbers were. Let's sort by the preference 1s. So of all votes above the line, 38% had Labor at 1, 9% had them at 2, 4% had them at 3, 39% did not preference Labor. Similarly for the Coalition, 30% put them at 1, 8% at 2, 6% at 3, 42.5% did not preference them. Greens, 11% above the line voters put them at 1, 19.65% at 2, a lot of those would be 1 Labor voters, 46% not preferenced, and so on. So we get a sort of a breakdown of which preference number is each party getting. The exhaust row here, mostly at 7, where most people's preferences stop. I think that covers all of the above the line sort of big ticket items of this custom query language. It's not quite everything. I will tidy up a couple of the missing pieces at the end. Now I want to go to below the line and we'll see a few different options there. Let's go to 2016 Tasmania. I sort of feel like if you're this far into a video on how to analyse Senate ballot paper data, you probably know what happened in the Senate election in Tasmania in 2016, but this was when 2 sitting senators were demoted to so-called unwinnable positions on the ballot paper. It was the first election with a new Senate voting system at which voting below the line was made much easier. Before 2016, you had to number all the squares below the line, and then now you're instructed to just vote at least 1 to 12. And Tasmania has candidate-based voting at state level, and they actually rotate the order of the candidates within each party's column on the ballot papers there, Robson rotation. So voting for specific candidates is very much part of the electoral culture there. And with two sitting senators demoted to low positions in their groups, Lisa Singh for the Labor Party and Richard Colbeck for the Liberal Party, that was sort of a perfect storm of circumstances for serious below-the-line campaigns to be run, at least quasi-officially. Everyone knew what the deal was, even if they didn't explicitly say, vote for me personally. It was... They knew, voters knew that they were supposed to vote below the line for those particular candidates. If I go to the step forward, Lisa Singh was actually successful. She picked up 6.12% of the total formal vote across the state. I guess I should say the other big factor in this was that this is a double dissolution election. So 12 senators being elected in each state, which means that the quota was 100 divided by 13, 7.7%, instead of the usual 100 divided by 7 of 14.3%. So the target, 7.7%. Singh picked up 6.12 on primaries and did manage to get elected, picking up enough preferences from other below-the-line voters. Colbeck just missed out, at least on the day. He did end up in the Senate because Stephen Parry ahead of him ended up getting the Section 40 forward. Had a father who was born in the UK before migrating to Australia when the father was like 11 years old, and therefore Parry, who was born in Australia, was considered eligible for citizenship of the UK and therefore not eligible to sit in the Senate. And so Colbeck ended up being elected on the countback, and he's since been re-elected twice from like first or second position on the Liberal Party column. Singh was put in a difficult spot in 2019 as well, but 2019 was a half-Senate election, and with a quota of 14.3%, she got something like 5.5%, not enough of a quota to get re-elected. So that's the basic state of play for the, or context for the, why I've chosen Tasmania 2016 for these examples. Let's go to the custom query. Basically, below the line voting is candidate based. And so if you replace groups with candidates, let's do row equals 1, send to the main table and map. Everything is structurally the same as what we had with the above the line analyses. We're just changing groups to candidates. And we can see here that the Lisa Singh getting 21.74 of the 28% of Tasmanian voters who voted below the line that year. We saw on the mainland in recent elections, it was like 5% below the line, but much higher rates in Tasmania. And we put candidates on the columns as well. Whoops, that's a typo. Send these ones to a pop-up window. Going to be a lot of columns here. Lisa Singh voters. Singh was in the 6th position in the Labor column. Most common second preference destinations are various other people in the Labor column, but also substantial minorities leaving the Labor ticket. 9.4% going to Jackie Lambie, 9% going to whichever Peter Whish-Wilson and Nick McKim this one is. The other one was the second on the ticket, splitting almost evenly between those. LP5 is Colbeck, so I think 6% of the Singh voters were sort of solidarity with sitting senators being demoted down the ticket. By contrast, Colbeck voters much more strongly staying within the Liberal ticket, although again 7.5% jumping over to Lisa Singh. Structurally, all of this is identical to what we saw earlier with the above-the-line votes. We just changed groups, candidates, and everything else follows. But we can aggregate results to groups. And now this expression here will not work because there are several candidates in a group, and so row equals 1 is ambiguous. And so if I press calculate, I get an error. An aggregated identifier, which is row in this case, the group is an aggregate of candidates now. Latter two cases, you identify cannot be part of a larger expression. Don't expect you to understand all of the subtleties there. That was very much me when I was like very deep in the writing of the syntax and the requirements of these expressions. It made sense to me at the time. Basically what we need to do is we either need to put this row inside one of these functions that can work on the aggregated expressions. And for a row equals 1 and col equals 2, the natural meaning that we want is at least one candidate, or like some candidate in the group, in the row group, got the first preference, and some candidate in the column group got the second preference. So that's going to be an any. And I put parentheses around the whole expression. So this thing here should be a Boolean, true or false. We put any around all of it, and any col equals 2. Pop-up window. A lot of groups back in 2016. Parties have been consolidating since then. 67% of people who voted for below the line for a Labor candidate gave their second preference to another Labor candidate. 6% went to the Liberals, probably Colbeck. 14.6% went to the Greens. 7.5% went to Lambie. Liberal Party below the line voters much more likely to stay within the Liberal column. 88.6% staying in the Liberal column for preference 2. We can break this down a little bit further. We can say, instead of groups and groups, we can go candidates and groups. And now we don't have an any for the candidate. So it's just row equals 1 by candidate and any group equals 2. So we can see specifically that ALP6 is Lisa Singh, 57.8% of her second preferences went to other Labor candidates. So that's less than the overall for the column. So it's like 67% for all Labor candidates combined going, leaking outside the group at preference 2, about 20% going to the Greens. Again, Liberal voters were much more loyal to other members of the same party, and 85.8% of Colbeck voters stayed within the Liberal column at preference 2. Maybe we would like to ask how many stayed in the column until they numbered all the first, whether it's 3 or 6 candidates. How many stayed entirely within the group? And for this, we need to know the number of candidates within the group, and there is a keyword for this. It's NC underscore, and then whatever it is, in this case it'll be a column. And so how are we going to do this? We're going to do NC col. We're going to need all of the column group to have a preference less than or equal to the number of candidates in the column. I'm not going to pretend that all of this is easy. You do have to think very carefully about what exactly you want to do in some of these expressions. Let's just pop that up. So 43.6% of Singh voters stayed completely within the Labor column for the first 6 preferences. Pretty sure there were only 6 candidates for Labor. Colbeck, 65% of his voters stayed entirely within the Liberal column. By contrast, Liberal Party won 83% staying in the Liberal column. This sort of wide table with lots of zeros, maybe not the clearest way of presenting this. You have to sort of find the corresponding column. So what I'll do is a trick that I have used repeatedly in these. Maybe it's groups. Maybe let's I think if we need candidate versus group, we probably need both of them. But if we aggregate on the group as well, now what we can do is for each group we can see how many of the votes stayed in there and how many didn't. And for the columns axis, I'm going to put 0 and 1. I'm going to any row equals 1 and col equals, and now what I'll do is an if function. So the if function works the same as the XL if or the SQL IIIF. So it's a 3-argument function with a Boolean expression, and then a value if true, and then a value if false. So at any row equals 1, and then if all of the row votes are less than or equal to the number of candidates in that row, so the preference given to each candidate is less than or equal to the number of candidates in the column, ballot paper column, then we'll put that into the 1, or maybe say 0 for non-leaking and 1 if it's false for leaking. And this we put in main table and map, only 2 columns. And we can see that 52.67% of below the line 1 Labor voters stayed completely within the Labor column 1 through to 6, and 47% left to preference some other candidate somewhere in the first 6. And when I click on this, I can see that the lowest number here is in what was then called Denison, now Clark. This is where Lisa Singh was most popular. And so a lot of her voters are jumping out to the Greens or elsewhere. Liberals, as previously, much higher rate of staying within the group. Greens, now not all of these are fair comparisons, because the Greens only had 3 candidates, whereas Labor and Liberal both had 6. So it's sort of easier for the Greens to stay, Greens voters to stay within the column. 79.7% of them staying within the column. Jackie Lambie, on the other hand, JLN also had 3 candidates, and most of them left. So a lot of Lambie supporters liked Jackie Lambie in particular and didn't much care for her running mates, and then went to other places for the preferences. This is a fairly unusual election in that there were serious below-the-line campaigns. If we go 2025 and do it again, only 18% of votes are below the line. A plurality of them now this year were for the Greens, and 77% of them stayed within the column. 80% basically Labor voters stayed within the column, 85% of the Liberal voters. Lambie, once again, personally popular. The rest of her party, not so much. We can do, I'm going to call them N-party preferred, although it's not necessarily parties here, it could be candidates. So you can do pick candidates like ALP6, LP5, maybe I should go back to 2016 for this to make sense. So Singh preferred to Colbeck 55.6 to 33.5 below the line. But we can also do a candidate versus a party. So Singh versus the Liberal Party below the line wins 54.5 to 37.2. But we can't do, with this syntax, a candidate versus their own group. So Singh versus Labor should give an error. NPP definition cannot contain both a candidate and its group. Now, it is possible to spoof this. If we want Singh versus rest of Labor, we'll need, we'll have to define some dummy columns. Let's call 1 for rest of Labor, 6 for Singh, and 999 means not preferenced, like no Labor candidate preferenced. Now, column will need an if. And the first thing we'll do is we'll get the votes that did not preference the Labor Party. So if the minimum preference given to a candidate in the Labor column was 999, so here we put the aggregated identifier inside the parentheses and the equals 999 outside. For any and all, it's the parentheses goes around the whole expression. But here we take the minimum first and then compare it to 999. Then it'll go to 999, this column. Otherwise, if, and we'll say if ALP 6 equals min ALP, that means that of the Labor candidates, Lisa Singh got the lowest preference number, so the highest preference. So we'll put that into the 6, and otherwise it's one of the other Labor candidates was preferred to Singh. And Singh beats the rest of Labor 48.3 to 27.9 among the below-the-line voters. Obviously, a lot of Labor voters were above the line, and what is now Clark around Hobart was Singh's sort of strongest area, and you can see above 70% of the below-the-line voters there preferring Singh to one of the other candidates. We can see the breakdown by group here, so we can put rows on the groups. So any row equals 1 and col equals that. So of the 28.26% below the line Liberal voters, 30.75% preferred Singh to someone else in Labor, roughly half of them not preferencing a Labor candidate. Of the Greens voters, very heavily preferring Singh to the Greens below the lines voters, I should say, very heavily preferring Singh to the rest of Labor. Lambie not so lopsided. Anyway, it's pretty fun stuff. Other things we can look at below the line, how many preferences do they give? And prefs. The savings provision for below the line is that you have to number at least 6 squares. So we don't get any formal votes from 1 to 5. They start coming in at 6, where there's 2.73% of the below the line voters mark exactly 6. Presumably, this is people getting confused with the above the line instructions. Interestingly, even in Tasmania, very strong below the line voting culture, most below the line voters are doing the minimum of the instructions and stopping at 12. 7% are going all the way, or in 2016 went all the way through to 58. Let's compare that to today, or this year, 56.8. So more people giving more preferences than just the minimum, perhaps because the ballot paper is smaller now, only 33. Only 33 candidates on the ballot paper. Okay. That's my tour of below the line votes. Oh, that was a cut in the video. Final little section. Things that are probably not going to be used so often, but they are features in the in the custom query language. One possibility is that you want to look at, for example, the difference between the preference number given to Labor and the preference number given to the coalition. And so you would like all the numbers on the axis that expression ALP minus LP or LP NP can take. Now, given that the number of groups on the ballot paper changes from election to election, the number of possible values taken by ALP minus LP will vary from one election to another, and there's no, well, maybe there is a shorthand, but it's not something simple like, oh, it's anything between 1 and N max, because the 999s will mess things up. We'll have, if it's one Labor and the coalition isn't preferenced, then that would be 1 minus 999, which is minus 998. And so you could have a wide range of those possibilities. You probably can work them out and put them into a single expression to put on the rows to figure out the distribution of the relative positions or relative preferences of two parties. But as a shorthand, there's an every function on a rows definition. So I'm in New South Wales here. So the coalition is LP NP. And the cell is going to be row equals ALP minus LP NP. The custom query language does not allow you to define a variable, so just having to retype this again, calculate. And I don't know if this is particularly useful. It does contain information about the relative position or relative preferences of these two parties. Most common is one party is preference and the other isn't, so the minus 998, and the flip side being the 998. And then the other possibilities are they're both preferenced, and because most voters give 6 preferences, the highest proportions are sort of in the middle here from and even at -6, or I guess 1 to 6 would be 5. So between -5 and +5, 0 being neither party being preferenced. So the every command, if you put that in a rows or columns definition, it does a first pass over the data set, computes each of the values, and then does the main calculation of sending each vote into the appropriate number. It takes an extra couple of seconds on my computer. I thought this is a good idea when I wrote it, which is why I wrote it. But to be honest, I have not found much use for it. I enjoy clicking around on these Senate ballot paper data, but this kind of distribution with the weird 999s, yeah, it's there if you want it. Can't say I overly recommend it. Another possibility, let's put groups on the rows. Columns 1 to n max. There is a function id for, let's do col equals id underscore row. And let's put this on votes because I know how this will end up looking. The id of either a group identifier, I meant to put this into a pop-up table. Okay, it's not so bad. This isn't too many columns, so it's not going to, it only took 6 seconds. Sometimes when I do one of these big 2-axis tables, more with below the line, it can take like 30 seconds or a minute or something, maybe even 2.5 in some cases. But okay, this is just strangely laid out. The ID underscore is the position on the ballot paper of the whatever comes next. So if I did ID underscore ALP, that's not in ballot paper order. This is in ballot paper order. Labor was first on the, had the first column on the New South Wales Senate ballot paper this year. So it had ID underscore ALP equals 1. Group B unlabeled was the second column. Australia's Voice was the third column, and so on. I don't know if this is useful for anything, but it just seemed like it's a thing that you might want. It's there if you need it, and if you don't need it, then you just don't do, you don't use it. Another possibility, another function is PI, preference index. So this takes an integer argument, usually a preference number, 1 to n max, and it will return the position on the ballot paper that got that preference. And I only have one use for the preference index at the moment, and that's to test for people who vote sort of donkey or partial donkey. So they're just numbering consecutively across the ballot paper. And the way we would test for that is you want the preference index of the second preference to be, let's say if it's going to the right, it'll be 1 greater than the PI of preference 1. And then PI of 3 should be 1 greater than PI of 2. So let's say groups on the rows, and then 0, 1 columns, and also for each primary vote given to one of these groups, were the subsequent preferences donkey, either to the right or to the left, or did they jump around somehow? This is not going to be a particularly fun expression to write. It's going to start easy. It's going to be row equals 1 and col equals if. So I'm going to have a big expression here to test if it's a donkey or not. And if it is a partial donkey vote, I'll call that a 1. And if it's not a donkey vote, then that'll be a 0. And so now, because I want to allow donkey votes to the right and to the left, I'm going to use absolute value function. So abs preference index 2 minus preference index 1 equals 1. And going to need to do this again for 3 to 2. Very high chance of a typo in this. Probably have to jump out to a text editor and make sure I get all the brackets correct. I'm not even testing that these are equal to 1. Hang on. That should be equals 1. So index 3 minus index 2 is 1. PI4 minus PI3 equals 1. PI5 minus PI4 equals 1. And PI6 minus PI5 is 1. Percentages. It worked. 1% of the above the line Labour voters were donkey votes. Labour had first position. Okay, not a lot of donkey voters. 37.86 times 1%, so it's 0.4% roughly of the above the line voters going donkey, and the fact that it's, it could be a genuine sort of vote for Labour. So the fact that 2 to 6 were donkey is maybe overstates how likely this is. Not sure. The coalition well over to the right on the ballot paper, and very few of their voters were a pseudo donkey vote. They would have to be going to the left for this test to pass, because there's not 6. You can't give a preference 6 to the exhaust, at least not with a preference index, because the preference index would be sort of 999 if there's no preference there. Greens right the way on the edge of the ballot paper. There are a few people who go right the way out to the right hand side and then go 1 through 6 backwards. If I go to Victoria, there's a nice little clean quasi-experiment. Because in Victoria, Coalition had the first position on the ballot paper, and just over 1% of their votes were donkeys. If we go to Labour, they're about in the middle of the ballot paper, 0.4%. marking 1 for Labor and then going 2 to 6, either directly consecutively to the right or to the left. Unlabeled Group T, very few people giving a preference to the unlabeled groups, and one of them was way on the far right. Only 0.05% of voters gave a 1 for the unlabeled square, and fully 5% of them were sort of reverse donkeys. And the final thing I'll say is it is possible to combine the preference index PI values with preference numbers, but I don't recommend it. It's just a recipe for being very puzzled by what it means for a preference number to be related to a particular position on the ballot paper. And as soon as you start combining these things, the interpretations get very difficult. So I haven't yet found a second application for the PI preference index function. Maybe there is one, maybe there isn't. But it's there if you want it, along with the ID underscore for the position of a row or a group. And that is my tour of the Senate Preference Explorer version 2 and its custom query language. If you want more content of this kind, then be sure to download the software and figure it out for yourself.